I refused to donate a kidney to my sister, and now my mother calls me empty space at family dinners. They think I'm just afraid of ruining my figure. But the truth is much worse. My name is Erin, I'm 32, and I used to think the hardest thing in my life was retaining a client who constantly missed payments at my architectural firm. I was wrong. The hardest thing is watching your own family try to erase you from existence because you don't want to die. It sounds crazy, but believe me, that's exactly what's happening. This all started just over 3 weeks ago. My younger sister, 28-year-old Caitlin, was diagnosed with a serious kidney problem. I won't go into medical details, but she needed a transplant. Urgently. Otherwise, dialysis was her future. And that wasn't a scenario anyone wanted. Caitlin was always the life of the party. Bright, positive, full of energy. Our mother, Sarah, literally lived for her. Our father, Richard, pretty much did too. Me? I was the one who moved to another state, started my own business, and called once a week. We were loved, but Caitlin was loved a little more. Or let's just say she required more attention. The doctors immediately started testing the family for compatibility. Our parents weren't a match because of blood type, which they were immensely distraught about. My older brother, Michael, and I were a match. Michael is 40. He has 4 kids and a stable job as a long-haul truck driver. He immediately said no. Not rudely, just, "Erin, you know my health is income for 6 people. I can't risk it." Mom just nodded then. It was expected. Michael was always pragmatic, and the family respected his decisions because they were always logical. All the attention, all the hope, all this huge crushing weight fell onto me. I remember the day like it was yesterday. 3 weeks ago, a Wednesday. I was sitting in Dr. James's office, the best nephrologist in the city, and he was looking at my results. Caitlin sat beside me, pale, but her eyes were full of hope. Dr. James cleared his throat and said, "Erin, compatibility with you are ideal. You are her best chance." Everything inside me tightened. I looked at Caitlin. Her smile was so fragile, so pitiful. But then the doctor flipped the sheet. He pointed to the section with my personal health indicators. "Now, your medical history, Erin. 3 years ago, you had a laparoscopic surgery to remove a cyst. Do you recall that afterward you had some issues with blood pressure and a minor anomaly in the function of your left kidney, which we considered insignificant at the time? Now, in the context of donation, this changes things." He explained, "Because of that old issue, plus my predisposition to hypertension genetics, thanks Dad, the risk for me wasn't 1 in 10,000 like for the average donor, but significantly higher." He named the numbers. I won't lie, it sounded terrifying. He said that if I donated a kidney, my remaining kidney would be working at its limit, and there was a high chance I myself would end up on dialysis within 10 years. This wasn't just danger. This was the probability that I would swap places with Caitlin. Dr. James, looking me straight in the eye, said, "Erin, as your treating physician, I have to be honest. This is risky for you. I do not recommend you do this." I walked out of the office feeling like I'd been punched in the gut. I didn't even get a chance to properly explain this to my parents. I just said I wouldn't be the donor. I said my doctor was against it, that it was dangerous. And then the toxic sludge began. Mom just went silent for a second, and then her face turned to stone. Dangerous? What could be more dangerous than letting your sister suffer? She demanded. At the family dinner last Saturday, when I tried again to explain that it wasn't my choice, that it was a medical fact, Mom looked at my dress, which accentuated my figure. And she said the line that became my personal stab wound. "Oh, Erin, let's not. We know you've always been obsessed with your body. Afraid a scar will ruin your perfect shape, right? You're just a selfish person who doesn't want to mess up her looks for the sake of the family. Caitlin wouldn't have done this." The whole family, including Caitlin, looked at me with such a mixture of judgment and disappointment that I physically felt the pain. They don't believe in my medical condition. They believe in my vanity. And I can't tell them the truth about my old problem without framing myself in the light they've already invented for me. And this is just the beginning of the month during which I will likely lose my family. I needed to do something and fast, but I didn't even know what. The whispers started immediately. I learned my sister was crying herself to sleep because of my refusal, and my mother decided the only logical thing was to cut off my business funding. The 4 days following that disastrous family dinner felt like an eternity stuck inside a microwave. Every time the phone rang, it wasn't a client. It was a family member calling to deliver a precisely calibrated dose of emotional poison. My brother Michael, the pragmatic one who said no for his own valid reasons, called me not to support me, but to tell me I was handling it badly. "Aaron, you need to soften the blow," he said, his voice flat. "Mom is losing it. Caitlin is getting sicker. And you're just throwing out cold, hard facts about your hypertension anomaly. People don't want facts right now, they want sacrifice. They want the hero narrative." The hero narrative. That was the core of it. They didn't see Caitlin's need as a complex medical decision for two adults. They saw it as a morality play, and I had deliberately chosen the villain's role. I tried to explain again, calmly, about Dr. James and his explicit warning, the one about me ending up on dialysis too. "But you look great, Aaron," Michael countered, and that one line summarized everything. "I work out. I eat right. I have a thriving business." Appearance, in their minds, was the only reality. Since I looked healthy, the risk must be minimal, or simply a fabrication to cover my selfishness. My small scar from the cyst removal 3 years ago was barely visible below my rib cage, a tiny fading line. It certainly wasn't the huge, life-altering disfigurement they imagined I was afraid of. But in their narrative it became the proof. I valued vanity over life. The most damaging thing wasn't the direct accusations. It was the passive-aggressive guilt orchestrated by my mother, Sarah. I got a text from my cousin Jessica, whom I hadn't spoken to in months, that simply read, "Thinking of you. Hoping you find the courage to do what's right for Caitlin. She's so weak now." Then came the crying herself to sleep story. Caitlin herself never called me to yell. She only sent short, weak messages. "I understand it's hard, Aaron. I just wish I knew what I did to deserve this." See? No direct blame, just the gentle, perfect victim framing. My own sister using my guilt against me, making me feel like the executioner. This week the real blow landed. My architectural firm is 3 years old. It's successful, but the initial seed capital, about $50,000, came from my father, Richard, as an interest-free loan to be repaid over 10 years. A formal agreement signed and notarized, but based on trust. Yesterday I got an email. Not from Dad, but from his lawyer. It was a cold 3-paragraph document stating that due to unforeseen family circumstances and an urgent need to cover medical expenses, the repayment schedule was being drastically accelerated. Instead of monthly payments over the next 7 years, I was required to repay the entire remaining balance of $42,000 within 30 days. 30 days. I called my dad immediately. He didn't pick up. I called his office. His assistant said he was unavailable. I drove to my parents' house, a 15-minute drive that felt like a cross-country trip. When I confronted him in the driveway, he wouldn't meet my eyes. He was watering the lawn, completely absorbed in the task. "Dad, what is this? You know I can't liquidate $42,000 in 2 weeks without crippling the business." He finally looked up, his face devoid of warmth. "Caitlin's medical bills, Aaron. They are astronomical. We need every penny." "But you have insurance, Dad. And why me? Why not ask Michael for help? Why not just sell some of the stocks you bought last year?" He turned the water off, his movements slow and deliberate. "Michael is supporting 6 people, Aaron. You're worried about an anomaly and a dress size. The money is legally ours to recall. Consider it a deposit on the kidney you won't donate. Or maybe," he said, and his voice dropped to a heavy, crushing whisper, "maybe it will remind you what family actually means before it's too late." I stood there, staring at the hose in his hand, realizing the true nature of their manipulation. They weren't just emotionally punishing me. They were financially dismantling my life until I had no choice but to comply. They were using the money, the very foundation of my independence, as a lever to force me to risk my health. I drove away, not answering the calls from my mother, who was certainly watching the confrontation from the kitchen window. I now had less than 4 weeks to either find $42,000 or commit to a dangerous surgery that my doctor had expressly forbidden. The pressure was building and the clock was ticking. I went to my parents' lawyer with my own medical records to prove I wasn't just vain. He read the file, looked me dead in the eye, and told me, "That's a nice story, but your sister is dying." The financial deadline hit me harder than any of the verbal attacks. It solidified the conflict. This wasn't about love or health anymore. It was about leverage. They had moved from emotional warfare to economic strangulation. The urgency of finding $42,000 in less than 3 weeks became a physical weight, pressing down on my chest every morning. I spent the next 3 days calling every bank and every lender I knew. My business was cash flow positive but not liquid positive to that extent. The banks loved my books, but the process would take at least 6 weeks. I even considered selling my car, a decent SUV, but even that wouldn't cover the full amount and would cripple my ability to meet clients. I needed to stop the acceleration of the loan, and to do that, I realized I had to fight fire with facts. I decided to introduce the medical evidence directly to my father's legal counsel, a man named Mr. Peterson, hoping an objective third party would force my parents to see reason. The meeting was this Monday, just 10 days after my father's ultimatum. I walked into his sterile, high-rise office carrying my confidential medical file, sealed and signed by Dr. James. I laid it out clearly. I explained the cyst removal, the subsequent vascular anomaly in the remaining kidney's function, and the specific risk assessment made by my doctor. I didn't hold back. I detailed the probability of my own kidney failure within a decade, stressing that Dr. James had literally advised against the procedure. Mr. Peterson, a man whose face seemed permanently set in the expression of someone smelling old fish, listened without interruption. He took the file, broke the seal, and read the key pages. He spent a solid 5 minutes absorbing the complex medical jargon, the charts, and the clear, unambiguous recommendation from my physician. When he finally looked up, I expected a moment of clarity, a flash of professional recognition of my legitimate concern. Instead, he simply closed the file and slid it back across the glass desk. "That's all very compelling, Miss Harrison," he said, his voice flat and perfectly rehearsed. "But legally, this is irrelevant. The loan agreement gives Mr. Harrison the unilateral right to accelerate repayment under unforeseen family circumstances, which a major organ transplant certainly qualifies as." I stared at him, my mouth dry. "But the medical risk? The fact that I'm not being selfish, I'm being prudent? Doesn't that matter?" Mr. Peterson leaned forward, resting his hands on the file. This was the moment of pure, cold conflict. In a court of law, that document is a nice story. It's an explanation for your refusal. But it doesn't nullify the loan contract. Your sister is very sick, Miss Harrison. She is, for all intents and purposes, dying. Your father is under extreme duress. He views your refusal, whatever its basis, as a betrayal that directly impacts his daughter's survival. He is using the only leverage he has to save his child. He paused, letting the weight of the word dying sink into the air. I suggest you look at this not as a legal battle but as a moral one. Find the money or find the courage to go through with the donation. Otherwise, your business is gone in 2 weeks. And so is your place in your family. I left his office feeling physically ill. The legal system, the cold, hard logic I had relied on, was useless. They had built a perfect trap. Either risk my life to be the hero and save my business, or protect my health and watch my professional life crumble, confirming their narrative of my self-serving ego. That evening, the tension escalated to a new brutal level. I decided to visit Caitlin in the hospital. I needed to see her face to face, away from my parents, to explain everything, truly explain the medical records she hadn't seen. I walked into her room. She was weaker, hooked up to more machines. The air felt heavy. "Caitlin," I whispered, sitting beside her bed. "I brought my doctor's report. I need you to read it. I'm not doing this because of a scar. I could end up just like you." She slowly raised her hand, resting it on mine. Her eyes were dull, but her expression was intensely sad. "Mom told me you were coming to try and confuse me with technical jargon, Aaron." "No, Caitlin, please," I pleaded, holding out the file. "It's the truth." She didn't take the file. Instead, she tightened her grip, looking straight into my eyes, the most honest look I'd seen from her in weeks. "I know you won't do it, Aaron. You never did the hard things. I get it. But Dad and Mom are worried about money now. They said if you just agreed to the surgery, they would drop the loan repayment and give you another $20,000 for your trouble. If you're so healthy, why not just say yes? It would solve everyone's problems." She wasn't asking for my life. She was offering a bribe for my body, A transactional exit from my debt. The $20,000 was the final devastating insult. Proof that my family truly believed my health concerns were just a bargaining chip for my greed, not a real threat to my survival. I felt the last thread connecting me to them snap. The moral dilemma had just become a raw, open wound. I signed the legal document confirming the repayment of the $42,000, signaling to my family that I chose my life over my money. Then my sister called me, not to beg, but to drop a bomb about my father that changed everything. I walked out of Caitlin's hospital room with that $20,000 bribe offer ringing in my ears. It was the lowest point. My sister, the person I was desperately trying to avoid sharing a medical fate with, was offering me cash to put my life on the line. They had fully commodified the situation. The realization was a sharp, clarifying cut. I had to choose a side fully and unapologetically. I could not save my family's emotional comfort and my own health and business stability. I had to let one go. I spent the next 2 days working with my business accountant and my lawyer, Sam. Sam understood the cruelty of the loan acceleration, but confirmed Mr. Peterson's ruling. Legally, Dad was within his rights. We decided on the only financially responsible course of action: liquidating some of my long-term business assets and finding a short-term, high-interest loan to cover the $42,000. It would hurt, severely limiting my growth for the next year, but it would save the company from immediate collapse. The following day, a Friday, I signed the documents finalizing the loan repayment schedule to my father. It was a formal, painful act of defiance. It screamed, "I will not donate my kidney, and you will not break my business to make me." I emailed the signed papers to Mr. Peterson, knowing my parents would receive the news within the hour. The emotional fallout would be catastrophic. I braced myself for the silence, the cold shoulder, the total exile. But the reaction was not what I expected. Instead of the usual barrage of hateful texts from my mother, the phone rang, and it was Caitlin. Not the weak, victimized Caitlin, but a voice that sounded strangely clear, almost calculated. This was 3 weeks into the crisis, and my decision was final. "Aaron, you actually did it. You paid him off," she said, without any preamble. I had to protect my business," I replied, steeling myself for the inevitable blame. "Right. Your business. And your perfect body," she retorted, the venom still there. "You know, when you told me about the loan acceleration, I felt terrible. I honestly thought Dad was just desperate for the money for my surgery." "He said they needed it for your bills," I stated flatly. She let out a short, cynical laugh. "Did he? Well, he lied. That's the part you don't know, Aaron." Plot twist. I clutched the phone tighter. "What are you talking about? The money is not for my bills. My insurance, your parents' gold-plated policy, covers all the costs of the donor search, the surgery, and my post-op care. It always has. We're financially fine." My breath hitched. Then why? Why the 30-day demand? Why threaten my business? Caitlin's voice dropped, becoming serious and intensely private. "Because Dad has a secret. And he's been terrified of it coming out since I got sick. He knew that the only way to pressure you into silence was to hit your wallet." She explained that about 4 months ago, my father, Richard, had been quietly preparing for early retirement. He wasn't relying on his steady income. He was relying on a significant lump sum payout from an investment he'd made years ago. That investment, it was tied directly to the life insurance policy he held on my mother, Sarah. It wasn't illegal, but it was highly unorthodox and depended on complex financial maneuvers he'd done through a very shady contact. "What does this have to do with me, Caitlin?" I demanded, my heart now pounding. "Everything," she hissed. "When you told Mom and Dad you couldn't donate because of your existing condition, that previous surgery, your hypertension anomaly, it scared Dad. Not because of your health, but because if you, the healthy daughter, had pre-existing heart/kidney conditions, it means Mom has them too. It's genetic, Aaron. They know it." She continued, the words tumbling out quickly. "He got nervous that Mom might need a transplant one day. And if you go through with the surgery now, the risk of your remaining kidney failing is high. If you fail and Mom needs a kidney later, Dad knows he can't rely on you. He wanted you to donate immediately to get the whole nightmare over with before his investment window closed." Caitlin finished with the ultimate revelation, the sharp, painful pivot of the entire story. The $42,000 he demanded from you wasn't for my bills. It was the exact amount he needed to cover a massive, sudden penalty fee from his early retirement investment because he was forced to delay pulling the funds. And he had to delay, Aaron, because your refusal made him panic about Mom's future health and the life insurance policy his investment hinges on. He didn't want you to ruin your figure. He wanted you to ruin your health now so he could keep his money safe for later. I hung up the phone, collapsing onto the couch. The whole narrative was twisted. It wasn't about Caitlin's life versus my figure. It was about my father's desperate financial scheme versus my mother's life insurance. And my health was just the currency he was trying to spend to protect his wallet. I had just paid off the loan, essentially giving him what he wanted, but now I held the real secret. I could destroy him, or I could use this knowledge to save my sister without sacrificing myself. The decision had to be made in the next 48 hours. I walked into my family's house on Sunday morning with 2 envelopes. One contained the paperwork proving my father's massive financial fraud, and the other contained the name of the only person who could save my sister. I forced him to choose between his marriage and his money. The revelation from Caitlin changed everything. My father, Richard, wasn't just selfish. He was a calculating thief who used his daughter's illness and my life to protect a shady investment tied to my mother's longevity. The $42,000 I just paid wasn't medical necessity. It was Richard's penalty fee. The entire month of pain, the shame, the fear, all manufactured to serve his greed. I spent Saturday contacting my lawyer, Sam. Caitlin had sent me enough specific details, dates, investment names, and the name of Richard's contact, that Sam confirmed the gravity of the situation. Financial fraud and breach of fiduciary duty, bordering on conspiracy, all centered around a life insurance asset he desperately needed to stabilize. I also did one last desperate search. If I couldn't donate, someone else had to. I used the hospital's public resources for compatible non-family donors, but found nothing immediate. Then, I remembered something Dr. James had mentioned in passing during our first consultation: the existence of a highly specific, but usually discarded, registry for deceased donors who had pre-registered for tissue banking. It was a long shot, but Caitlin's rare blood type and antigen match might fit a profile. I drove to my parents' house on Sunday morning. It was exactly 3 weeks and 4 days after the crisis began. I walked in, finding only Richard and my mother, Sarah, in the kitchen. Sarah was stirring coffee, looking tired and cold. Richard was reading the newspaper, radiating a smug, satisfied air, having secured his $42,000. Aaron, to what do we owe this visit? Richard asked, not lowering his paper. I ignored him and looked at my mother. Mom, I want you to sit down. This is important and you need to hear it all. Sarah reluctantly sat at the kitchen table. I didn't want to hurt her, but Richard had to face this immediately, before he could spin another lie. I placed 2 plain white envelopes on the table side by side. Richard. I began, my voice steady, betraying none of the chaos inside me. The first envelope contains a detailed report from my lawyer, Sam. It outlines your entire early retirement scheme. It specifies how your investment payout is contingent on Mom's life insurance policy, and how you needed $42,000 to cover the penalty fee when you panicked and had to delay the funds after I refused to donate. Richard's face went white. The newspaper dropped from his hands, sliding across the floor. You don't know what you're talking about, he stammered, his eyes darting to Sarah. I know everything, Dad. You didn't need the money for Caitlin's bills. You used her sickness and my medical history as leverage to bankrupt my business just to save your own portfolio. You risked my health, and you emotionally destroyed this family, all for a payoff. Sarah looked from Richard's panicked face to the envelope. The realization hitting her was a wave of pure, silent devastation. Richard? Is that true? She whispered. He jumped up, moving toward me. Give me that. You are trying to sabotage me. Stop, I commanded, raising my hand. Look at the second envelope, Dad. This one is different. I tapped the second envelope. This contains the name and coordinates of a medical facility in another state. After you destroyed my trust, I did what I should have done from the start. I looked outside the family. Dr. James gave me the key. This facility has an extremely rare, perfect antigen match for Caitlin in their deceased donor registry. The window is tight, less than 72 hours, but the match is there. It's safe for her and it's safe for me. I looked at him, giving the final, crushing ultimatum. I have the power to save Caitlin right now, Richard, with no risk to myself. And I have the power to ruin you and expose your greed to the woman who thinks you love her. You have 30 seconds to decide which envelope I open first. You can either call the lawyer and formally resign from the board of my company, sign over the loan repayment back to my business as a gift, and never ever speak of my health or my figure again. Or I open this first envelope and give it to Mom. The silence in the kitchen was thick enough to choke on. Sarah was watching him, her face dissolving into horror and betrayal. Richard stood there, caught between his financial ruin and the total collapse of his marriage. He looked at the first envelope, the paper prison of his secrets, then back at Sarah, the woman whose death he was financially counting on. He slumped back into his chair, defeated. "I'll call Sam," he muttered, covering his face with his hands. "I'll sign everything." I slid the first envelope containing the legal evidence back into my purse. Then I gently pushed the second envelope, the one with Caitlin's hope, toward my mother. "Call the hospital, Mom. Now. Caitlin has a chance." I watched Sarah pick up the phone, her hands trembling, the knowledge of Richard's betrayal burning in her eyes. I had saved Caitlin. I had saved my business. But the family? It was irreparably broken. I left the house without a word to Richard. The last thing I heard was Sarah's tearful voice on the phone, arranging the transport for Caitlin, followed by a heavy, profound silence from the man who had just traded his integrity for $42,000. I had won the battle, but I walked away with a profound, hollow truth. Sometimes the greatest sickness in a family isn't the one that needs a new organ. It's the greed that needs a total excision. I had my life and my business back, but I knew I would never truly go home again. The cost of saving myself had been the death of my family's beautiful lie.